Lula victory, it is, I guess, the certainty we are in the right path, and the growth of the left wing and entirely South America. It's mean changes are happening, and it is
right.
Yeah.
Before you get into your talk, I think just to welcome everybody to the meeting. Nadine will be chairing it. If everyone could please mute themselves. It's being recorded on Zoom. If you don't want your face to be seen, please don't put your camera on. And if you wish to change your name, feel free to do so. Thank you very much. So I'll now pass over to Nadine to start the meeting.
Okay, good afternoon, all of you. I suspect people will join as we go along, but because we've got quite a packed agenda, I think I'm going to ask the first two speakers to begin. Elder's going to speak, first of all, from a member of the Workers' Party here, and also a member of an organisation closely associated with the Workers' Party. And she'll speak for about 10 minutes about what's been happening there. And then Francesca will widen out and talk about the rest of Latin America. And then we'll have some questions to you two. And I don't know how long you can stay, Elder. Will you be there till Francesca finishes?
He'll be after me.
Yes.
Okay. So, how long time is you talk, Francesca? How long time is Francis talk?
20. He's got 20 minutes.
But don't, you know, if you have something else to do, don't worry. I won't be offended. Don't worry about it.
No, I would love to stay. I probably will be able to stay between 15 to 20 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll ask at the end of your talk. I'll ask people if there's any questions for you, Elder.
Okay, please. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, Elder, I'm going to get you to start and tell us. We did have you at the meeting in September, I think, when you were hopeful of a victory. And now, of course, it's been a great victory. So if you can just fill us in from your perspective, it'd be great.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be back and an honor to be here, speak on this platform. Of course, we are still celebrating Lula's victory. It means a lot to us Brazilian people. We are a population of around 250 million people. It is a very large country. And even though Lula didn't win with a huge margin compared to Bolsonaro, we need to bear in mind it was not all the Brazilians went out to vote. So it doesn't mean half of the country voted for Lula and the other half voted for Bolsonaro. No, we had nearly around 40 million Brazilians. It didn't show up to vote. So that makes a big difference. And we not show exactly who those people will vote for. So therefore, we cannot say the country is divided. I will say in the sense of the people who went out to vote, yes, was almost 50-50 between those two candidates. I will say on my perspective, what I believe and I hope so is changes are happening in Brazil. Saying that, we know it's not going to be easy for Lula to govern. We know we need to be very patient. We need to understand, because it will be very hard for us as a left wing, the Workers' Party, govern Brazil. And the fact is, the majority of the Brazilian Congress and Senate are not left wing. The majority of those people is elected. They are still part of Bolsonaro ex-party or Bolsonaro politicians. It does support Bolsonaro government. So we know it will be very hard for us. But we've been there on the government before. When Lula was president, was the time as Brazilian people, we live the best, was the time Brazil has huge change. We had policies implemented in our country, what benefits the majority of the population. What it is the majority of the population? It is the Black population. We are the majority in Brazil. So those populations is also the one are the poorest one in the country. And the policies and the public policies implemented when Lula was president, it did make a huge impact in our lives. It did make a huge change. For instance, one of the changes that happened in Brazil was the quota system, which is open up men's placements for the Black Brazilians and the indigenous Brazilian have the possibility and the opportunity to go to university, have a degree, and that was very important. Lula always invested a lot in education because he knows a country when they have access to education, those people has access to think for themselves, has also access to have better life. And that was a huge change, and there was a big impact in our population. Looking forward to now, we know Lula made compromise with us, with the Brazilian people, even those who didn't vote for him. He's been very clear since day one on his first speech, saying, I'm not going to govern just for those who voted for me, but I'm going to govern for the 250 million Brazilian people. I've been elected to be the president of the country, of all the population. It doesn't matter if you're left or if you're right wing, you are Brazilian, you live in this country, I need to govern for the all. He also made clear he's going to prioritize on his government those most in needs, those being more marginalized, and that is the Black Brazilian community and the indigenous community. For the first time, we are going to have as well secretaries and ministers where he's going to be defending those two populations. The compromise he made with the indigenous people as well in order to protect the Amazon forest, in order to do the demarcation of the lands, to make sure they who have a right and entitled to their lands. It's the same compromise he made as well with the quilombolas, what it is. The quilombolas in Brazil, it's very similar to the Maroons on the Caribbean. It's the enslaved Black people, what is run away the time of slavery in Brazil, and they make settlements of community. And today there is more than 6,500 communities, what making a number of millions of quilombolas live in settlements throughout Brazil and inside the Amazon forest as well. So one of the main things is for those communities to have legalized entitled to their lands. So therefore, we know they are protected as well. Their traditions, their cultures are protected. Brazil is a very complex community, is a very complex country. Being governed by Bolsonaro for 4 years, he made as well this huge division. Bolsonaro brought a lot of violence, a lot of division between families and the workplaces. And Lula has the responsibility as well, wants to unite our country again, to unite our people again, what is not easy. But he is going for it. He's really looking for to do that. And the history of Brazil, just to say how bad Bolsonaro government was. Bolsonaro is the first Brazilian president in the history never to be re-elected. We have other presidents back in Brazil. He always went for a second mandate and they was elected. Bolsonaro didn't. So that, for instance, to show how his government was really, really bad. He's trying to say the election, it has fraud. He's trying to say the election, the results, it's not the true results. Him and the party he represents, it tries to impugnate it, it tries to stop and to revise some votes in some areas, and those areas is the areas where Lula has the most numbers of votes. Of course, the Department of Justice in Brazil, the judicial system, it didn't accept his pledge, it didn't accept the pledge of his party. What they did was fine him and fine his party with a huge sum of fine to make sure why they did was not legitimate, why they did was illegal, trying to challenge that when they know everything was legal and all the process was a safe process. Brazil used that same system of voting for the past nearly 3 decades, and we never had no problem whatsoever before. Bolsonaro was elected as federal deputy 5 times before he became president. He never challenged the electoral system in Brazil. So why he's doing now for the first time? The answer is simple. It's because he didn't been elected. So that's why he wants to challenge. There is a huge similarity between Bolsonaro and Donald Trump. Him being called the Donald of the tropics. So we know that's going nowhere. He's been nowhere to be seen. He's hide since Lula's victory. He didn't speak to the country. He didn't come up. He didn't say absolutely enough. So we exactly don't know what's going on. But to be honest, we don't care. We don't mind. We have 28 days to go for Lula to become our next president. We are having now the transition government. What is happening? The transition is happening now. And unfortunately, we are taking Brazil on his knees. Our country is broken. We have no reserves whatsoever. Bolsonaro took Brazil with a reserve of more than $300 billion. We are taking Brazil with 0 new. So that as well, it will be very hard for us to make sure we will be able to go back for who we was before Bolsonaro became a government in Brazil. So our situation looking now, we have a lot of hopes. We know Lula doesn't make promise, Lula make compromise. And when he make compromise, we know he's going to do his best to make sure those compromise will be achieved. So we are looking forward to that. As a Black population, we are seeing the growth of the left wing in South America. We saw a Black woman being elected as a vice president in Colombia. You are seeing the changes in Chile and Argentina. Now we see it happening in Brazil and so on in other places. I know Professor Francisco will give a better picture of that. But my perspective, it is in Brazil. We're going to see change. It's not going to happen in the first year. It will take a little while for those changes to happen, for those changes being implemented. And our job, it is to be patient and to wait and be there with Lula to make sure he has the enough support from inside Brazil and also support from the international community in order for him to govern. Because if he tries to implement anything from the first few months of government and he doesn't succeed and the international community start to criticize him, then Brazil is not going to stand a chance to grow again. Brazil is not going to stand a chance to change and change for better. So our hopes, it is we're going to see change. It will happen. It will take maybe a little time, but this is going to happen. And Lula knows he has a community outside Brazil as well, support him, back him up, back the government. We have as well, that is not 100% the Workers' Party government. When Lula was president for the first 2 mandates, was most 100% was left-wing. This time, we was needed in order to be elected to make, let's say, we was needed to open our umbrella to bring more parties together with us. And that became the parties as well. We represent the vice candidate, Alckmin, what is more center than left. So we have huge numbers of others party being part of this coordination, being part of, and they also will be governing Brazil because our system is a democratic system. So it's not 100% the left wing, it's not 100% the Workers' Party or Lula alone governing Brazil this time. So we'll have more opinions, we'll have more people, decide what's going to happen. And it is a challenge, it will be a challenge, but as it is a challenge, we are looking forward to it. And we're going to overtake and overcome every single obstacle, one after another, during the time coming. But yes, that is my view. And I'm delighted for the election of Lula. We're still celebrating. We are looking forward for the inauguration day, which is 1st of January. And you are all invited to watch. We're going to send the links around to celebrate it as the beginning of the new year and the beginning of the new Brazil, the Brazil of hope for all of us. Thank you very much. Solidarity to all.
Thank you very much, Alda. That was really inspiring. Thank you. I know you haven't got much time, but I'm going to ask people if any quick questions they want before you go. If you just put your hands up if people want to ask a quick question. I can't see any questions. Can you, Steve?
Dirka Prout has, if I pronounced that correctly, has put her hand up.
Dirka, could you want to ask a question?
Yes, could I just unmute and do it?
Yes, do you, please.
Okay. All right. Hi, Elda. It was great to hear of all the things that Lula has done. Here in Canada, what we found is that when conservative-leaning politicians get into federal or provincial government, they usually put in place a lot of laws that and they do it at such a pace that it's very difficult over one term to undo those laws. Has that been the same with Bolsonaro?
Yes, definitely it has been the same. And all those laws, it doesn't apply to the majority, it doesn't apply to the working class, it doesn't apply to the masses, let's say. It's against those people. It is against the so-called marginalized society, because you cannot choose the term minority, because minority in Brazil is the white population, not the Black and the indigenous population. But yes, that was implemented in Brazil. That year happened. What's going to be another thing hard for us to reverse, because like the working class, it lost a lot of the laws what is benefits the working class population. We did lost a lot of our rights inside Brazil, and that is things are going to take a little while and may not happen on the next 4 years of government, because they being the majority on the Congress and Senate, they will not vote to reverse or to change that. So we need to come up to other options around to see how can we make those laws better in order to favor this population, not be the other way around. Thank you for your question.
Thanks very much. And Ernie, Lem?
Yes, thank you, Nadine, and thank you, Elda, for the wonderful work you've been doing in London, running PhD activities, albeit in the face of some aggression from Bolsonaro supporters. Now, my question is, President Lula ran on a very radical, progressive and reformist agenda, which I think is much needed in Brazil. I've followed Brazilian politics for a long time. But he doesn't, or the pace, he doesn't control Congress and the Senate. So what plans does President Lula have in place to be able to work together with these senators and congressmen and women who predominantly are Bolsonaro sympathizers, to be able to implement that very radical, very, very positive agenda? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annie, for your question. Yes, of course, the best way of having understanding with any other side being opposition is through dialogue, is through conversation, is through talking. Of course, as the Workers' Party and also the group of MPs and senators supporting us. There is a number of senators and MPs being elected as well, what they are not even left wing or no as well right wing. And we know those people, the people has the same views we have in terms of changing the laws and implementing new policies on the country. That is when the people know we can count with them inside those two houses. But the only way around, the only plan is sitting down with them, so it's groups of them and the talk. There is no other way. Because you've been a politician as well. If you don't do as well what the majorities of the country needs, you're not going to be elected again. People are not going to vote for you when you are exposed in the sense he was not a good politician. And they know the results come from Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was not re-elected president of Brazil again because the majority of the Brazilian population didn't agree with his government. So these new MPs been elected and those who was re-elected as well, they also know they need to make as well a certain type of deals, let's say that, in order to please the population, he voted for them as well. So there is plan in place, there is projects in place. All now is just talks, it just begin. We are doing the transitional government at the moment. One of the things we want is aim to be able to have a certain number of budgets. We are aiming to go to the highest possible in order to put back money, invest back in the health sector and the security and the public sector, also on the education. But in order for us to do that, we need to have those there approve that budget. And we want to go for 4 years. They already told us they will allow just for 1 year. We are hoping to get for 2 years, so that will allow us to start to work and be able to start bring the economy of Brazil back again to a bit of growth. And our main aim of the Workers' Party is to make sure those more than 35 million Brazilian people, it doesn't know where the next meal will come from. People really starving are able to have food on the table. That was the compromise Lula made, was what he said in his first speech. If I'm able to see every Brazilian person to have the main 3 basic meals on the table a day, I know the fact what I've been elected was already good enough, because you only know what hunger is if I've been there, and Lula knows he's been there. When he was in the first government, I'm sure you know about that, he was able to lift 32 million Brazilian people out of the extreme poverty and hunger. So this is one of the things, and we know we'll be able to do that. Of course, there is others way we are going to talk, we are having a meeting, so it's a bit early for me to say to you exactly the plans right now, how we're going to do it, because we are having meeting with those people every single day in order to know how we're going to do and deal, because many of them represent different sectors of Brazil. Some represent the church, the evangelical church, what is a huge group. Others, it's more of the military case where they represent the civil police, the military police. There is others represent other sectors in Brazil. And those are the people more hard to talk and to make plans and make decisions with, but we are getting there. Thank you so much for your question. I hope I'll answer.
Thank you very much, Elle. That's really interesting. Please stay as long as you can. I know you have to go and celebrate, but please stay as long as you can. I'm going to pass over to Francesca now, who many know, who is the former head of Latin American Studies at Middlesex University. He's going to look at the kind of landscape, the large landscape of socialism in Latin America now. So Francesca, got 20 minutes.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Elda, for, without Brazil, what would we do? Such a weighty, important, decisive country. The first wave of left-wing governments began in 1998. And it created a dynamics that, one country after another, not all of them, but many of them, elected left-wing governments committed to structural transformation and committed to eliminate all the worst aspects of neoliberalism. Some countries went as far as even to enact through referendum anti-neoliberal constitutions, which is, is extraordinary. But most importantly, all of them went for a policy of putting people first. This meant, such as in the example that Elda gave us in Brazil, between 36 to 40 million people were taken out of poverty in less than a decade, which is an extraordinary thing. And if you were to take Latin America as a whole, in 2004, which already the process of the left-wing governments had begun, in 2004, the level of poverty in the region as a whole, in the whole of Latin America, was about 48%. That is to say, nearly half of the population of the country, of the continent, was living below the poverty line. By 2014, 15, 16, because of the policies of the left being implemented, that figure had come down to 26, 25%. That is to say, in less than a decade, left-wing governments demonstrated that it was possible to fight poverty, and they have taken something like 100 million people out of poverty in the whole continent, which is extraordinary. Not only that, they went for a very heavy policy of nationalization. They nationalized many of the natural resources, and Latin America is very rich on those. And as a consequence of that, the countries were able to benefit from the extra revenue that accrued to them as a result of the nationalization. That is to say, multinational companies, they stopped benefiting as much as they used to do. So let me give you one example. There is plenty, but I just concentrate on one to illustrate what that meant. Ecuador, which is an oil-producing nation, a small nation, had an arrangement by which multinational companies got 80% of the revenues of the export of their oil. And Ecuador itself got only 20. When Rafael Correa, the left-wing government, came to office in 2006, he reversed that to make sure that the nation got 80% and multinational companies got 20%. If you were to look at the arrangements in the region in terms of gas, minerals, and so on, something very similar took place in many other places. So, as a consequence of obtaining these extra resources, extra revenues, these governments were able to plug that back into social development. So illiteracy was eradicated in at least 5 countries right away. Certainly in Venezuela in 1.5 years, more than 5 million people were made literate as a result of the policy of abolishing illiteracy. Health was given as a good, which was universal and free to the whole population. In incredible places. In Brazil itself, I remember I've been given, I gave lectures there at the time, and there were new universities created, more than 14 new universities that gave opportunities to many people that never had the chance. And I remember by their outlook and their complexion that the people who came to my lessons in the interior of some of the cities I visited were actually from poor background. And unlike civilized countries like the UK, university education in these countries was free of charge, and it's still free of charge in many of these places. So that gives you an idea of what was going on. One of the key examples of what the Latin Americans were able to do was, as a result of their regional efforts, regional integrated efforts, they launched, Venezuela and Cuba launched an initiative on health, which was called Operation Miracle. And this was a program that identified people who were blind as a result of cataracts and similar eye ailments in the region, including in the United States. They were flown in from wherever they were into either Venezuela or Cuba to undergo surgery, and they had somebody who accompanied them, who was also flown in with them. The flights were free of charge, the operations were free of charge, and these people were flown back after the convalescence, which was also free of charge, back to their countries. In about 5 years, they were able to carry out more than 4 million such operations. So that gives you an idea of what could be done. And although Cuba is a poor country, is a medical power, Venezuela had the resources because of the oil. So one can go on to expand more of these. So what people call this decade is more than a decade, but as a shorthand, we call it a decade, a golden decade of, social progress, which was incredible. But as a consequence of the criminal behavior of capitalists, they brought about a world crisis in 2008, the so-called credit crunch. And because of that, then our economies in Latin America, being heavily dependent on the export of raw materials, suffered enormously as a consequence of this, certainly Brazil, Venezuela, and others. And the United States immediately used this to capitalize on the problems that this crisis created. And the United States coupled these with sanctions and aggression. And the country that's been most attacked by the United States is Cuba, more than 62 years. But in the case of Venezuela, the United States applied more than 900 sanctions, which, blockaded this country almost totally, plus other things that they did. And as a consequence, the United States undertook an offensive and began to recover country after country by overthrowing governments, such as in the case of Brazil, where they impeached Dilma Rousseff, and they imposed Michel Temer, a neoliberal who created the grounds for the election of Bolsonaro, with terrible consequences, as we know. So in a very short period of time, the United States was able to recover, their positions in many countries in Latin America as a result of left-wing governments being unable to win elections, as a result of US interference, as a result of demonization campaigns, as a result of interference in the internal affairs of our nations. And it looked as though the United States was going to recover the continent completely. But we are back. We began to make gains absolutely everywhere. I don't have the time to mention all the countries that we won elections in, but it's wonderful to know that we won everywhere. But this time round, we even won election in Mexico, which we didn't have in the first wave. We have an excellent left-wing government in the form of President López Obrador in Mexico, who is liaising with others in order to create the conditions for what we really need in Latin America, which is regional integration. So we have left-wing governments in Mexico. We're going to have a left-wing government in Brazil. Already Lula is more or less governing because he's dictating the agenda quite dramatically during the transition. We have a left-wing government in Chile with some complexities. We elected a left-wing government in Peru. We certainly elected a left-wing government, the first woman president in the country called Honduras in Central America. Even better, we elected a left-wing government in Colombia, which looked like impossible 2 years ago. And so we have now, on top of all of that, the fact that despite US aggression, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba were able to survive, resisted successfully, and now they're recovering quite substantially after the aggression. There are still problems, but definitely we're on the way back. So all these nations want to do desperately is to actually regionally integrate themselves. And there are several proposals that they have. I cannot go through all the proposals, but just to give you an idea of where this is going. Number one, the Lula said recently that he had made a mistake by not really taking too seriously the proposal made by Hugo Chavez, president of Venezuela some time ago, to create a single currency for the whole of Latin America. It would be a single cryptocurrency, not like the euro. This is not the idea, but by having our own currency and then making sure that we're able to conduct our foreign trade among ourselves in our own currencies, that will avoid us to have to use the dollar, thereby giving us an enormous amount of extra autonomy, which is fantastic. That's number one. But you cannot have a single currency without having a single bank. So the idea is to set up a Bank of the South. And the Bank of the South, as was nearly set up in 2008, the crisis prevented us from setting it up, is to have a fund available to the Latin American countries that would actually will make the IMF and the World Bank redundant, that thereby giving us even more financial autonomy, and any country that were to go through any problems in the economy, which is normally the case with weak economies, then our country will be able to actually support them with soft loans and so forth. And all of these will be in a context where education, health, and universal rights of every imaginable kind will be for all. And by us acting together, we will be able to withstand any pressure from the United States and certainly from Europe. And given that now, as a result of the crisis that being created by the war in the Ukraine, particularly on the issue of energy, gas, oil, and so on, that the Europeans are shooting themselves in the foot, maybe in the head, by not buying, cheap oil and cheap gas from Russia. In our case, we are rich in resources. So now the real economy is going to be resources rather than the printed dollars, which the United States used to do with alacrity. So therefore, we are going to be in an excellent position to do all of these. And the dynamics that are being created already will have political consequences. So give me 1 minute perhaps to concentrate on the politics and then end with that. Just to give you an idea of the significance of this, the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia has created a synergy between Colombia and Venezuela, which is definitely securing the peace process in Colombia, where most of the people who are assassinated in the region take place in Colombia. This peace process is going to be secured by Venezuela being made a guarantor, but also by Norway being part of the process of securing the peace process. And the agreement is that they will invite Brazil, they will invite Venezuela, and they will invite Mexico to be guarantors of the peace process, thereby ensuring that Colombia stop being a strategic military position for the United States. After all, the United States has 10 military bases in Colombia, which are a threat to our security, to our safety, and to peace in the region. Once and if the process of peace is secured and guaranteed, I can assure you that there is not going to be any need for those military bases to be there. So therefore, the whole push will be towards ensuring that Latin America is free from US military bases. There are a few around the place in there. So this is one very important dimension that is taking place in Latin America. And it will definitely strengthen our sovereignty and our right to self-determination, which is enormous. So just to finish with this, if you take the deposits of lithium of Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Mexico together, that represents 67% of the total in the world. And lithium is the next wave of economic expansion in the world economy. There is no question about it. And we have 67% of these resources. And all of the countries that actually have, with the exception of Peru, where there are some problems, have already established state companies to make sure that state controls these resources. And more important, that they're discussing among themselves to set up a cartel of lithium producing countries in Latin America, such as the OPEC, about oil, that will give them an enormous amount of bargaining power vis-a-vis anybody. And given these cartel will definitely, create the conditions for a massive expansion of trade, development, welfare, and what have you in the region. And it will definitely weaken the possibility and the potential for the United States to interfere in our nation. So once Brazil joins in after January, these processes are going to be massively strengthened. So we cannot wait for Lula to be in the presidential palace, on January the 1st. And we will win this time. And this time round, we will not make the mistakes of the past, and the United States and the capitalists in the world will not be able to engineer crises that they used to create in the past to weaken us, because they weaken themselves too much. And therefore, the future is ours. Thank you very much. Viva Latin America.
Thank you very much, Francisco. That was really interesting. And it's hardly everybody here, but particularly people who remember what happened in the 70s and 80s and the hopes of the countries that were then invaded or overturned by America. I'm sure there are questions for you, Francisco. Who would like to ask a question or make a comment?
I think they agree with me.
They do. It's very positive what Francisco said. Are there any queries or any? Oh, Laura, you've got your hand up.
It's 2 hands.
Difficult for me to unmute and everything else. I wanted to, I'll take my hand down too. I wanted to ask you what you thought. I assume that Cuba comes under your purview. So I wanted to ask you what you thought the future of Cuba was going to be and how, if at all, we can help. I taught in Cuba I went every year for 5 years to teach. So I got to know it fairly well, but I understand from my friends there that things are really dire at the moment. And I wonder if there's anything we should be doing more than people are doing now.
Yeah. Can I answer this right away?
Yes, do. Yes, please.
Well, Cuba suffers from the massive US sanctions, particularly the intensification of them under Trump. Biden has not done anything to stop it, even though he committed himself during the election campaign to, sort of normalize the US relationship with Cuba back to where Obama left it off. But he hasn't done anything about it. I think it's because of the pressure of the Cuban Americans and the extreme right wing in Florida. The main problem that Cuba faces now is the consequence of a combination of the US sanctions and the collapse of tourism as a result of COVID. Cuba was getting something like 5 million tourists a year before COVID. And with COVID, you can imagine, people would not travel and so on. In many places, it collapsed quite dramatically, went down. In the case of Mexico, it went down by 75%. But in the case of Cuba, tourism went down by 96%. So that gives you an idea of the problems that they have. And the poor Cubans, they were dependent on the export of sugar before. That was the main revenue earner. And they overcame that. And they went for, not only after the collapse of the USSR, they reinserted themselves into the world economy by expanding tourism quite massively. It's a wonderful place to do tourism. That's why they expanded from something like 200,000 tourists to 5 million in no time at all. So imagine the amount of revenue, the amount of jobs that generated, the amount of money that people were getting, the amount of enterprises that were established, hotels and so on, taxis, etc. And that was going to be the main thing. And then boom, COVID just collapsed, made it collapse. So as COVID is receding quite dramatically, I think Cuba has every opportunity to recover. That's one problem. The second problem is that one problem is going to be resolved. People have started to come back. So in terms of your question, one thing that you can help Cuba with is just go and be a tourist in Cuba. Go right away. Don't wait. Have a good time. Go on and spend your money over there. So that's number one. But number two, because of the sanctions against Venezuela, then Venezuela was prevented from actually exporting any oil whatsoever, and Cuba was heavily dependent on Venezuelan oil. Now that Venezuela is recovering and the tourism industry is recovering as well, then these things are going to massively improve the situation of Cuba. What Cuba has, there is more, but that gives you an idea of where things are. Cuba is the world power in medicine. And it can export, it's been exporting this quite dramatically. As anecdotally, they, for example, produce a medicine called PPG5 that people may want to take down as a piece of information. PPG5, which is a zinc that reduces the cholesterol levels in the blood quite dramatically, but it has a terrible side effect. It enhances people's sexual potency quite dramatically. What the Cubans were telling me about this at the time, they said, Francisco, we were very surprised that suddenly tens of thousands of Latin American men discovered that they had high levels of cholesterol and they were importing our medicine from Cuba. What I mean by this is, I know this is sort of funny, but what I mean is Cuba is able to produce vaccines against hepatitis, vaccines against meningitis. He's produced 5 vaccines against COVID, 5, not 1, 5. And all of this, gives Cuba a tremendous power. And then the final thing is, the political system of Cuba is organized in such a way that unless there is a massive, huge US military invasion, the Cuban Revolution is going to survive. So therefore, I would say, given that the United States is not in a position to go for it, so far so good and will recover quite nicely. There you go.
Thanks, Francisco. Glenmore, you've got your hand up.
Thank you.
Glenmore, you've got your hand up?
Yes, greetings, comrade, and thanks for the presentation, both of you. I just really want to congratulate the Brazilian people again about their successful reversing the situation in Brazil. It's, people, I don't think really appreciate the momentous task that it is. We have a right-wing government here, and instead of pushing them back, we seem to be increasing their influence and increasing the numbers of seats they have from the last election. I mean, they seem fairly much this time round to have decided that they're not going to get anywhere. What we get instead, we could have a debate about that as to whether we're moving from right to left, but that's another discussion, I think. There is a momentous task that the Brazilian people now have to face up to. There are many things that need reversing that Bolsonaro has done, as poisoned society in Brazil and globally, because it doesn't just remain within the boundaries or the borders of Brazil. So I hope the international community are standing by to assist, give whatever solidarity support to the Brazilian people we can, because I don't see just the election of Lula as a massive sea change. I think there is work to be done. And I hope the international community, as well as the Brazilian people, are ready. But congratulations again, because it was a momentous task to reverse a situation where an ultra right-wing leader, if we can call him that, is in situ. Well done. And I hope the journey from here on into the changeover of presidents is fairly straightforward. Thank you. Congratulations again.
Nadine, if I comment on this very briefly, so
Yeah,
that
do, please, yeah.
perhaps Elsa can comment more or better than I. You're right. Every time we make a gain in Latin America, we have to face huge number of problems. You know, everything is difficult. And this is normal. We are not impressed with that. This is the way it is. In the case of Brazil, the destruction of the economy was so intense that the level of recovery is going to take some time. Nevertheless, one of the key reasons why Lula was able to win was because a section of the entrepreneurial class, I'm using my words very carefully here, decided that they wanted to have a government that produced economic growth. And the only person that will win the election with that program will be Lula. And that's why they are behind it, because in 2012, the GDP of Brazil was 2.7 trillion. By now, the GDP of Brazil is 1.6 trillion. If you take the combined GDP of all the Latin American countries together, that is about 6 trillion. So 1.6 trillion is huge already, but 2.7 will be gigantic. And the capacity of the state in Brazil to actually massively improve the capacity of the country to invest in productive investment is enormous. When Lula and Dilma were in power, 70% of the credit obtained by private capital came from the National Bank of Development, which is a state bank. They didn't go to the private banks. So the leverage that the state has is enormous. And by concentrating on the 33 million people who do not have enough to eat every day, and concentrating on the 100 million poor people that Bolsonaro produced, that will reactivate the economy in itself by the state intervening in the economy. So it's not going to be easy, but the potential is enormous. And more importantly, Brazil is not alone. You know, it will link up very quickly, very rapidly, not only with Latin America, because Brazil is a giant, and is already part of the Chinese Belt and Road project. Brazil is part of the BRICS. Brazil will play such an important role in Latin America, but also in the world. And if the Brazilian economy moves in any direction, it will shift the center of gravity of the whole of Latin America and of the world without any problem. So I know that the situation is difficult, but the potential for Brazil to change things is also enormous.
Thanks, Francisco. I'm just going to take Paul then, Elder. Paul?
Yeah, just a quick one. Thank you both very much. I'm very happy with the news, of course. Francisco, you mentioned about tourism in Cuba. I know we're not really talking about Cuba as much, but here in Jamaica, the tourism has actually bounced back to above where it was before COVID. Not that ordinary folks benefit that much. In fact, there's been complaints recently that ordinary people get so badly paid in tourism that the benefits are nowhere near as good as they should be. But I just wonder whether there's some political interference stopping Cuban tourism bouncing back as well as it has done here in Jamaica.
Well, the figures are promising, but it depends on people that are suffering enormous consequences, particularly in Europe. A great number of the tourists that came to Cuba came from Canada. It was about 1.5 million that came from Canada. And we always wonder, we do not know, I do not know, but we always wonder whether it was people from the United States that actually went to Canada in order to actually make it to Cuba because it's illegal. And if you make it to Cuba illegally and do not have any justifiable reason that support, approved by the State Department, then you might be sanctioned by between $10,000 and 10 years in prison. So it's quite heavy. So therefore, this is part of the problem that they need to ensure that they concentrate. Trump sanctioned the ferries that were taking people from various places to Cuba. So that's something that needs to overcome. The advantage in the case of Cuba is that the benefits of the monies, the money that people spend coming to Cuba spread very quickly throughout the population. So the moment, somebody comes to the airport and somebody gets their luggage, they get $1. The moment you get a taxi, then somebody else gets, whatever number of dollars. Once you get to the hotel and so on and so forth. And most tourists in the case of Cuba, most tourists in the case of Cuba will eat in places called paladar, which are family restaurants. And the family restaurants actually are entitled to have maximum 12 chairs. So that gives you an idea that, it's real family business. So therefore, somebody's calling me, I'm sorry. And therefore, the benefits of tourism is quite spread socially in Cuba. We have to wait and see. I think that the figures are going to be much better because now that the Latin America is recovering, economically, then these Latin American tourists, I think, are going to make it to Cuba.
Okay, just a quick response. I'm glad to hear about what you just said about the spread of the wealth in Cuba from tourism. In Jamaica, I think we were the first country to have all inclusives, and that is really a problem. People are not even encouraged to leave their hotels, so the money doesn't spread in the same way.
Yeah, there is also, sorry, Nadine, there is also, very luxurious hotels in Cuba by, chains of tourism such as Melia and Solar, which is Spanish consortium. But this is done on the basis of an arrangement with the Cuban state. And the state normally gets 51% plus out of the arrangement. Part of the conditions is, number one, they have to maintain the wages of the workers, all the benefits of the workers, and they cannot dismiss anybody from. So when you go to a Cuban hotel, one of the things that strikes you is the number of people who are there doing not much, if you see what I mean. So they are sort of overstaffed. And the reason is the state ensures that the interests of the population are protected by this influx of foreign capital. And the state gets, significant 51%, if not more. So in that sense, the comparison with Jamaica, you will see the distinction between the two.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's good. Elder, do you want to say something?
Yes. I just want to make a remark on Glenn comment. Yes, the destruction Bolsonaro left in Brazil, it is huge. And the next 4 years of Lula government, we will not be able to reverse that just inside 4 years. The task we have ahead, it's a very hard one. So yes, we most definitely need the support of the international community to back Lula's government, to back us up in order for us to be able to govern Brazil. So you are very right there on your words. And for Professor Francisco, I just want to know your opinion. With a resurgent left, what do you see it is next for us South American?
Sure. Okay, look, number one, in terms of the solidarity with Cuba, which I should have mentioned before, is join the Cuban Solidarity Campaign. It does excellent work. I think I'm a member of the executive committee of the Cuba campaign myself. So what I'm saying may sound partial, but I think it's true. I think the Cuban Solidarity Campaign in the UK is the best solidarity campaign that Cuba has in the world. Different from governments that support them, which obviously have more resources. But in terms of solidarity, we do a sterling work. So joining them, by joining them, not only will get information, will know what initiatives are taken. For example, there was one, Music for Cuba, where thousands, I don't know how many tons of instruments, musical instruments that people have and use in the country, in the UK, were shipped there in several containers. So imagine what this meant for the Cubans, thousands and thousands and thousands, a very musical country that get, free of charge. Suddenly, these thousands of instruments, violins, trumpets, you name it. It was wonderful. And the response that we got was enormous. And then medicine, whenever there is a hurricane, we always make sure that we collect money, medicines and so on, and we send it over there. So that really helps enormously. Now, in terms of Brazil, just to comment a little bit on what Elda said, there is a section of the military in Brazil, and it's a section, we do not know how much support they have in the rest of the armed forces. I don't think it's too great, but it's the top echelons of it. Some of them are fascists, openly fascists, openly, willing to wage a coup d'etat, and openly supporting Bolsonaro. And they are sort of coalescing together, getting together, in this period of transition. And they are threatening with all sorts of challenges that Lula is going to face in the future. So although Lula will recover democracy, will strengthen democracy that was massively weakened by Bolsonaro, there are still significant threats and significant challenges that we need support from everybody all the time. And I know the Workers' Party and the work that people like Elda and others do will keep you informed. So please link up with them. There is also an organization here called the Brasil Solidarity Initiative, which also does excellent work with parliamentarians and trade unionists and so on. So they will keep you informed. They will organize events, etc. And in terms of what's next for Latin America, I think regional integration is absolutely the key. Cuba is a world power of medicine. Mexico is a world power of many things, including industry. Brazil is the 10th largest industrialized country in the world. Argentina is a world power of agriculture. Venezuela has the largest deposit of oil in the world. These 5 countries I mentioned, have 67% of the deposit of lithium. Brazil has more water than anybody else, which is, the water that we need to survive in the world. Bolivia is a world power of gas. And one guy can go on mentioning. So if we get together, if we integrated regionally all of these things for the benefit of the people, including for the benefit of everybody else, on a sort of fair basis, I think we will get very far. And we don't have to depend on the West to purchase our things under their conditions that will make us dependent on wild fluctuations in the world market every time something goes wrong. And every time something goes wrong, as we know, because they run the show. The idea is that we stop them from running the show and we control our own destiny in that sense.
Thanks so much, Jessica. I'm just going to take 2 more speakers because we've got another speaker, as you know, David Horsley. So sure. Laura, then Anne.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments. One of the problems with tourism in Cuba is that one of the things that Trump did was that he made it illegal for things. He made it illegal for Americans to stay in hotels that had anything to do with the army. As the army does rather a lot of building, this meant that most of the big hotels were out of bounds if you had an American passport. And the other thing is that the ships that used to come, that used to do their rounds around, the islands. I mean, when I was there, there were constantly these enormous, extremely expensive ships with extremely elderly Americans coming to visit Cuba, and they were also banned. They can't be there anymore. And those were 2 of the problems that brought in that what's his name? Who's our president now? I forgot his name. And I voted against him too. That he brought in. And another thing that I really love talking of hurricanes is that when Fidel was alive, everybody who's old enough will remember the hurricane, and I can't remember the name, that destroyed New Orleans when one of the Bushes was president. I can't remember which one.
The second one.
This is the second one.
Yeah.
Baby Bush.
George W.
Yeah, as opposed to Papa Bush. And at the time, President Bush absolutely just acted like it wasn't there. So Fidel sent him a note saying, if you need doctors, we can send you as many doctors as you like. Of course, he never took it up, but that was, I think that was Hurricane Katrina, Dirka says, probably right. I'm afraid my memory is fading with age. I thought it was lovely.
Yeah, in terms of tourism, Mexico gets 45 million tourists a year. 45, 47, 48, that's sort of figure. And 35 million out of those come from the United States. So the main market for people coming to Cuba is not necessarily the United States, although it has been because of very specific reasons. I think everybody in Latin America is angling for the Chinese tourist. In 2019, before COVID, China did not send, I don't mean the state, but the number of Chinese tourists that went to the world as tourists was 150 million. So if you capture 1% of those 150 million, your tourist sector is sorted. So what you need to do to ensure to get to that market is not much. And therefore, the Chinese tourist is extremely generous because they spend 70% of all the resources they have compared to everybody else. So if they, there seems to be
someone is, I don't know if
there is some fight going on somewhere.
Paula's not muted.
Maybe it's the sound of the class struggle.
Yes.
But anyway, so what I was saying is all of Latin America, obviously in different ways and with different mechanisms, are trying to orient themselves towards the Chinese tourist. And the Chinese tourist is looking for other opportunities because they've been sanctioned as well by the United States. So the one country that is going to suffer after everything settles is going to be the United States, because their tourists will not have too many places to go to, and the United States is going through a severe economic difficulties. 43 million people below the poverty line, huge amount of an epidemic of opium, drug addiction, and the economy is declining. So anyway, just to make a long story short, I think we have tremendous possibilities, but we have to go through this period of turmoil that we're coming out from. And hopefully, since we have recovered politically, we'll be able to get all the economic things sorted out. There is a question on Africa, if I'll make it very brief. Brazil has established relations with 27 African countries, and the policy of Brazil is to make sure that they have this very strong connection with Africa. Cuba has traditionally very strong connection with Africa. Venezuela began to develop similar links with them. And there is a sort of triangle that is taking place now. Latin America, through China particularly, but also directly, is linking up economically with Africa. And there are very good political connections with Africa. Some of the countries in Africa, visit various presidents in Latin America regularly. The problem is what exactly they can trade in, but there is no question about it that they are part of the triangle of resistance against imperialism.
Thanks so much for this. I'm just going to take Anne, then we're going to move on to David Horsley. Anne? Are you still there? You need to unmute yourself, Anne.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Yes, sorry about not putting my camera on. I wanted to ask Francisco what was his opinion about the chances of Lula being destabilized and toppled, as in the case of Delma.
Yeah, there is a possibility, but the party that organized this in the past is the PSDB. Do not worry about the name, it's just a right-wing party. And that right-wing party, because he participated in the impeachment of Dilma and in all the destabilization process before, got massively discredited. And this political party, the PSDB, used to get between 52 to 48% of the vote. 52 when he won and 48 when he lost, if you see what I mean. And the Workers' Party would get the opposite. So in the last election, the PSDB had no candidate that filled it. And they have to fall behind the candidate of a woman called Simone Tebet, who actually scored 4% in the election. That is to say, the party collapsed. And as a consequence of that, they want to rebuild themselves. And we don't know exactly where they're going to rebuild. And Bolsonaro has 99 MPs in the Congress, but the Congress has 513 MPs. And there is a huge current in the center. There are people that are not necessarily pro-Bolsonaro. So in order for them to be able to destabilize Lula in the same way that they did to Dilma, they will need to win over, a substantial amount of them. But in a context of economic recovery, rather than a context of an economic crisis, that was what Dilma faced. So the chances exist, I'm sure they would like to, but the possibility and the context doesn't. So therefore, we're hopeful that Lula will be able to sustain any possible pressure that may come from them. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Francisco. Thanks. One mustn't has to stay vigilant and not underestimate the capacity for mischief.
Absolutely. That's
Thanks.
why I'm calling on everybody to join the various organizations to be part of the support for Brazil in solidarity, because they will need it. Thank you so much, Nadine.
Okay.
This is great exchange, and I'm delighted that people ask you so many questions. Excellent dialogue. Delighted. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica. It was a great session. I'm now going to hand over to David Horsley, who's a retired teacher and still as a historian, and he's going to talk about Ferdie Smith, who's a very interesting Black trade unionist, who I knew little about till I read up about it. David, please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to start with a big thanks to my comrades in CLS for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm especially grateful to CLS because they published my little booklet on Billy Strachan in 2019. This led on to the Communist Party asking me to write my booklet on Claudia Jones the next year. I mention these not as a plug, but because both of these outstanding Caribbean communists worked at different times with today's subject, Ferdie Smith. I'm also grateful to the eminent African-American historian Gerald Horne for his definitive biography called Red Seas, Ferdinand Smith and Radical Black Sailors in the United States and Jamaica. Highly recommended. Also, thanks to the late great Buzz Johnson, also a CLS member, for republishing a booklet, This Man Smith, which was published in Jamaica in 1952. The other source of written information came from the amazing Billy Strachan archives, which had many references, especially from letters and documents sent from Richard Hart, living in Jamaica in the 50s and 60s. I also had the privilege to meet with and interview
a number of outstanding communists who had been leaders in the Caribbean labor and independence movement. And I mentioned three: Trevor Carter and two founders of CLS, Cleston Taylor and Richard Hart. I met them and others in the late 1990s and interviewed them. These people introduced me to the name of Ferdie Smith, and in that spirit, I would dedicate today's talk to them. Now, Ferdinand Smith was born in Savannah-la-Mar, Sav-la-Mar as Jamaicans call, on the 3rd of May, 1893. But there's an interesting point here, because in July 1855, an American ship called the Young American docked at Sav-la-Mar, and on board was a fugitive from slavery by the name of Anderson, also known as Nettles. Local Jamaicans found out about it, boarded the ship and rescued him, taking him ashore. And as slavery had been abolished in Jamaica years before, the authorities refused to hand him back. The US consul protested vehemently, but was ignored. So he warned American ships in the area with black seamen on board not to dock in Jamaican waters. A wonderful example of solidarity, and a story that Ferdie Smith would probably have grown up with. Back to our man. While still attending school in Sav-la-Mar, he helped his family by pushing a handcart on the wharf, earning 1 shilling and 6pence a day. Gerald Horne tells us in his book that Ferdie Smith did attend college later, but lack of money forced him back to labouring jobs. The awful economic conditions and unemployment in Jamaica led him to travel to Kingston in 1913 with his brother, where they boarded a vessel bound for Panama. Many Jamaicans had done the same for decades, working first as labourers building the Panama Canal, and then staying on to work. According to Horne, there were about 9,000 Jamaicans in Panama in the 1880s alone. Ferdie Smith was there for 5 years, working as a hotel waiter and as a haberdashery salesman. I must note the Panama Canal Zone was under American jurisdiction, so Jim Crow ruled, with its barbaric color bar ruthlessly enforced. In 1917, Ferdie Smith left Panama to find work in Cuba. And some more figures from Gerald Horne's book. It's estimated that between 1912 and 1924, 230,000 contract workers came to Cuba from Haiti and Jamaica. And in 1914 alone, for example, there were 24,000 Jamaicans working in Cuba. After being in Cuba for less than a year, Ferdie Smith took a decision that changed his life when he got work as a seaman on an American ship. He eventually rose to the rank of ship steward. And in 1920, he entered the USA in Mobile, Alabama. Encountering the extreme racism of the southern states, he joined a ship traveling to New York. And incidentally, he joined the International Seamen's Union. On shore leave in New York, he discovered a vibrant, thriving black world, the black world of Harlem, which included a growing West Indian community. He would probably have heard many of his Caribbean compatriots speaking to eager listeners in Harlem. The most important, of course, being Marcus Garvey with his Universal Negro Improvement Association. Others were Richard B. Moore from Barbados and Cyril Briggs from Nevis, both of whom joined the Young Communist Party. Another Caribbean communist, Otto Huiswood, he came from Suriname. He was the first Black member of the American Communist Party and was sent as an official delegate to the Communist International in the Soviet Union. Influenced by these and others, Ferdie Smith joined the Communist Party himself in the mid-1920s, but for years had to keep his membership secret for fear of jeopardizing his job. By now, he was regularly sailing as chief steward, which is a privileged position on board ship. Ferdie Smith sailed all over the world throughout North and South America, African countries, China, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. Writing an article called "Why I Am a Communist" many years later, he states, and I quote, "I was particularly angered by the miserable, overcrowded, underfed prisoners in their own country I saw in Africa." He went on to write that on a trip to Russia in the 1920s, he encountered people rich in culture and material goods. These experiences led him to struggle on behalf of workers, and especially for Black people, leading to him to study the theory of the class struggle. Now, conditions on board merchant ships in those days were generally atrocious for seamen. And Gerald Horne, in his book, states that the highest death rate and suicide rate of any industrial workers was among Black seamen, who were generally given inferior jobs, with union organization on board ships almost non-existent. And the one that did exist, the International Seamen's Union, had a corrupt and racist leadership, which very rarely fought for better working conditions. Ferdie Smith had achieved the highest position a Black man could reach at that time on a ship as chief steward. And his success in keeping that rank was due to his positive attitude to the crew and his experience as a waiter in his hotel days. The steward's job was difficult because the disgruntled crew could often aim their wrath at him. But Ferdie Smith's character and skill in preparing food enabled him to rise to that rank, where he was part chef and part counselor for his shipmates. Now, from 1930 onwards, the American Communist Party put Black liberation at the forefront of its work. This was due to the work of Black communists inside the party, like those I've mentioned earlier, Briggs, Moore, Huiswood, and others. The same militancy on this issue led to communists and other activists in unions who were dedicated to their members' rights and fighting against racism, and sometimes forming new unions. Thus, the National Maritime Union, I'll call it the NMU after this, was formed with Ferdie Smith among the leading members. By the mid-30s, the NMU was the largest American seamen's union, and Smith was elected to a 9-man strategy committee to organize the seamen. As the only Black member of the committee, he agreed to take that position, in his own words, I quote, "on one condition: if we win, the union will not tolerate segregation or discrimination of any sort," unquote. This led to many Black seamen joining the NMU. Ferdie Smith's positive character and anti-racist persistence led to the union becoming the first integrated union in the USA, and his own election to the deputy leadership of the NMU, a quite astonishing achievement with a majority white membership. Now, in 1938, workers in Jamaica had demonstrated and gone on strike because of the effects of colonialism, resulting in mass unemployment, poor wages, and awful living conditions. Ferdie Smith, on behalf of the NMU, made contact with striking dock workers in Kingston, and his union members sent funds to the Jamaican workers there. Also, NMU members on board an American ship, the Veragua, docked in Kingston, came out on strike in sympathy with the demands of the Jamaican dock workers. These are just two examples of the internationalism of the NMU under the leadership of Ferdie Smith and his comrades. In 1943, while the United States, allied to Britain, the Soviet Union, was at war with Nazi Germany and fascist Japan, and the mayor of New York called on Ferdie Smith for assistance. The police in Harlem were notorious for their racist brutality, and a rumor had spread that police had killed a Black American soldier. As thousands demonstrated the alleged killing, some people started looting a number of businesses in Harlem. The mayor, Fiorella LaGuardia, one of the few more enlightened American politicians, not wanting to deploy more police, called on Ferdie Smith to help. He took him to the hospital and showed him the black soldier who was in bed, injured, but obviously not dead. Ferdie Smith made a radio broadcast stating that the man was alive and went on to warn the police on air not to be so trigger happy and use peaceful measures to disperse crowds in future. He then toured Harlem, explaining to people the situation. Such was the respect for him in the Black community, the looting ceased. Now, so successful was his intervention that mayors of other cities followed his example by making similar broadcasts. When Franklin Roosevelt ran again for the presidency in 1944, and I must add here, the Communist Party, of which Ferdie was a member, was supporting Roosevelt in the 44 election. Ferdie Smith was asked by Roosevelt to tour US cities with other prominent Black Americans to support his bid for election. I cannot stress how important Ferdie Smith was to Black Americans in the early to mid 1940s. As someone in a powerful position who always challenged racism wherever it was. One great example is the great radical Black artist, Charles White, either a communist or very close to the Communist Party himself, who was commissioned to paint a fantastic mural, 18 feet high and 60 feet long. This mural, called The Contribution of American Negro to Democracy, The Contribution of American Negro to Democracy, it included Smith in the magnificent painting alongside Frederick Douglass, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Paul Robeson, and many others. Now, with the death of Roosevelt in 1945, followed by the presidency of the reactionary anti-communist Harry Truman, Ferdie's days were numbered. The McCarthy witch hunts attacked American communists, radicals, liberals, and anyone who was against Cold War policies. Militants in unions were removed, and those who served in the leadership of the NMU turned against him and expelled him and his supporters. Ferdie Smith was arrested by the FBI in 1948, charged with being an alien advocating the overthrow of the US government by force. Interned on Ellis Island, he went on hunger strike in protest and was eventually released on bail. He then immediately threw himself into leading a mass picket in New York and was arrested again. Bailed out again, he led a delegation to Washington. This delegation was to protest the death sentence of Lieutenant Gilbert, a Black officer in Korea. The Korean War was at its height then. Lieutenant Gilbert Smith had refused to lead his men on a suicide mission and was due to be shot. Smith's intervention saved Gilbert's life, but within days, the government cancelled his bail. And in 1951, after living in or sailing from the States and back again for 33 years, he was deported. He went first to London, because as a Jamaican, he was a British citizen, and then on to Vienna, where the World Federation of Trade Unions had its headquarters. He was highly respected by the World Federation of Trade Unions for his pioneering lifelong work in the Seamen's Union, and was appointed Assistant General Secretary of that vast worldwide body. And it's significant that a Black person was in such a high profile position. He was able to use his contacts in the Caribbean, Latin America, the African continent, Asia and Europe. And he lived up to his last words on being deported, which were, I quote, wherever working men are struggling, there you'll find Ferdinand Smith, end of quote. So the World Federation of Trade Unions supported anti-colonial struggles worldwide, which it still does today. The organization is still alive. Most of the trade unions that belong to it, certainly the South African unions do, the Chinese, Vietnamese, Cubans, and a number of others. So Ferdinand Smith, as assistant general secretary, was working in an office in Vienna, but this was not him. So he wanted to be out there organizing. So in 1952, when Billy Strachan was set to tour Jamaica, Ferdinand Smith set off with Billy Strachan, and they made a most successful tour of Jamaica, speaking to huge crowds of workers. Energized by this tour, Ferdie Smith resolved to settle back in Jamaica and work in the labor movement there. Now, 1952 was a crucial year in Jamaican politics, as the so-called Socialist People's National Party, under pressure from Britain and the USA, purged its most radical members, including, of course, our late President, Richard Hart. The militants in the PNP were activists in the PNP's union, the TUC. That organization was promptly expelled, and Norman Manley set up a new union, the National Workers' Union, in its place. Ferdie Smith, Dick Hart, and other left-wingers set about organizing Jamaican workers, and for a time had success in forming sugar workers into a militant new union. They also attempted to form a new progressive party because, as Smith stated, I quote, "Jamaica needs a strong, broad national party, embracing all elements, willing and able to work for national independence, led by men with courage, determination, and honesty to liberate the country from its real enemies, imperialism and colonialism." In 1952, the People's Educational Organization had been set up, mainly by Dick Hart. They had a bookshop in Kingston with radical literature and regular education lectures. Dick Hart was the main person involved until the arrival of Ferdie Smith later that year. The reactionary Alexander Bustamante Jamaica Labour Party government and the equally pro-Cold War opposition People's National Party of Norman Manley had their followers attack meetings of the TUC and the new militant unions. The colonial authorities egged them on, and using the anti-communist weapon, they obstructed attempts to form a new party. And over the years, workers drifted back to the old unions. And Ferdie Smith and Dick Hart's attempts to organize a socialist party never succeeded, despite valiant efforts by them and other Jamaican activists. I cannot stress enough how successive Jamaican governments did everything in their power to crush the attempts to create a political party that was truly for the people. They hounded Smith, Hart, and the others, and intimidated their supporters, broke up meetings, confiscated literature. People were blacklisted from jobs and beaten up. Politics in Jamaica was a dangerous business. Despite this, Dick Hart, Ferdie Smith, and others persisted, and actually in 1955, they set up the People's Freedom Movement, which immediately took up issues of unemployment and fighting rises in public transport fares. The East German government helped out by sending them a film projector and speaker, but these were immediately confiscated by the police. By the mid to late 1950s, Ferdie Smith, he was ahead of other people here. He was understanding the role of Rastafarians in Jamaica as part of an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle worldwide. According to Gerald Horne in his excellent book, Norman Manley, the Premier of Jamaica, was worried about communist influence from Ferdie Smith and Dick Hart's organization. seeing it as, I quote, a plot to overthrow our party, the PMP, unquote. Ferdie Smith had put out a brochure that appealed to Rastafarians with the following words, I quote, the anti-federation struggle must also absorb the demand of the racial groupings of being repatriated to Africa. They constitute a large section of the people, and their demands fall within their rights of racial origins, though it must be understood that repatriation to Africa can never be a reality without freedom from imperialism. End of quote. He also wrote about Anglo-Saxon imperialism and colonialism. Ferdie Smith said they saw peoples of colour as, I quote, fair game to be killed if they refuse to or reject the European colonialist ever so kind offer to carry their burdens, unquote. Now, since 1955, Ferdie Smith had been unwell. He was under the care of a distinguished Jamaican doctor, Rudolph Orb, who in 1960 reported his condition as suffering from chronic diseases of the arteries, affecting mainly those of the brain and of the heart, with 2 attacks of cerebral thrombosis and 1 of coronary thrombosis, causing degenerative weakness of the heart muscle, especially during the warmer months of the year. Ferdie was offered medical treatment in the Soviet Union or Czechoslovakia, but was constantly refused a passport by the Norman Manley government of the day. Richard Hart in Kingston continually lobbied the government and organised protests to grant Ferdie Smith a passport. Dr. Orb informed the government that he needed the treatment in the 2 countries mentioned, saying, I quote, this is the doctor's letter to the government, this is necessary to prevent deterioration of his condition. It is strongly recommended that he stay at least 6 months of the year in a temperate climate considerably more northerly than Jamaica, preferably under medical supervision. Yet again, the Jamaican government refused. This was the Manley PMP government, by the way. That government refused the application. Ferdie Smith's comrades rallied round, and an American comrade and friend, Margaret Parry, raised the money to get a cottage built in Moko, Clarendon, where the mountains offered slightly cooler climate. For her humane gesture, Margaret Parry was denounced as a communist and was denied re-entry to Jamaica. A cottage was constructed with special efforts by a Jamaican who served in the Royal Air Force, just like Billy Strachan during the war. He was a Jamaican communist. He'd returned to Jamaica with his English wife, Anne, and alongside Richard Hart and others, they got this cottage built for Ferdie Smith. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1960, Ferdie suffered 2 successive strokes, temporarily losing the power of sight and speed, and also control of his limbs. His great strength of character pulled him through. And again, Richard Hart contacted the government, telling them that a move for hospital treatment in the Soviet Union or Czechoslovakia would be the difference between life and death. Dick Hart went on to write, I quote, if Mr. Smith dies now or in the heat of the coming summer, will it be wrong to call this murder by political means? Eventually, in April 1961, he was granted permission to leave the country for medical assistance. But because of his poor health, he could not travel until September. Tragically, Ferdie Smith died on the 14th of August, 1961, in his new cottage in Moko. At his funeral, family, friends, and comrades paid homage to him. And I'll leave the last words, which were Richard Hart's at the funeral. I'm going to quote from part of Dick Hart's speech, where he says, perhaps this is an appropriate time to mention the presence here with us today of one of the vice chairmen of the People's Progressive Party of British Guiana, the party led by Dr. Cheddi Jagan. This presence is symbolic of the great bond of sympathy that there was between these two great men, Ferdie Jagan and Ferdinand Smith, who shared in common their honesty, incorruptibility, militancy, love of humanity, and faith in the future, which is the foundation of sincere leadership. In conclusion, let us ask ourselves, what is the meaning of Ferdie's life? His life is a shining example, not only because of the loftiness of his ideals, but because working for their achievement is a part of the world where reaction, in a part of the world where reaction is most firmly entrenched, he has never faltered, never lost faith, never betrayed. May I tell you of his last wish concerning his burial, which was conveyed to me through his wife, Sonia. He asked simply that those of his comrades who might be present sing at the graveside the traditional working class hymn, The Red Flag. When the customary ceremony is concluded and our dear friend's body has been interred, I will ask all his comrades here present to join in singing The Red Flag. That was a speech from the speech of Richard Hart, his close friend and comrade, at Ferdie Smith's funeral, which was held on August the 16th, 1961. I end.
Thanks, David. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up for anybody to make comments or ask questions. I mean, I was very interested in his connections. I didn't know about his connections with Ferdie Jagan and the other people he'd come across. I did know he'd been involved with Richard Hart.
Yeah, they worked together. Well, all the 9 years that Ferdie Smith was in Jamaica, he and Dick Hart worked very closely together. And I think with the connection with Ferdie Jagan would have been, I guess, mainly through letters and messages carried, and the Guyanese unions would have been part of the World Federation of Trade Unions as well. And also, I mean, he was. So I think there were those Caribbean connections. But and here, Billy Strachan actually is an important character because he's based in London and he's in touch with Ferdie in Guyana and Dick Hart in Jamaica, along with others like John LaRose in Trinidad.
Yeah, I think it's a really important part of history. It's very interesting. Steve, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I was put in mind by what you said about the this sort of the radicalism of United States dockers and seamen, and it reminded me of a couple of years ago when the West Coast dockers, 30,000 of them, walked out on strike in protest at the murder of George Floyd. And that they got Angela Davis to speak on their picket line in Oakland, and it struck me that there is that continuation of that kind of maritime workers sort of progressive solidarity and militancy that I suspect Ferdinand Smith would have been pleased to have heard of.
Yeah, you're so right, Steve. And don't forget, in the 1930s, seamen from Britain and America in particular would carry messages to workers in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, which was very dangerous for them because if they were arrested, the captains of their ship would not have protected them. And I know there was an American seaman who was jailed in Hamburg in the mid-30s. One more thing on that. The volunteers for the American volunteers for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain, the largest contingent were American seamen, with a huge contingent. So you're absolutely bang on there.
That's interesting. And is he remembered in Jamaica now by Jamaican activists? Do you know?
I doubt it. I don't know. I doubt it. He died, what, is 61? I mean, even Richard Hart, who, I mean, a giant of a person in my eyes, in all ways. It took the PMP, I think, until, was it the 1990s to evaluate him?
Yeah.
But I think I'm lucky enough to have met Dick, and such a man who did so much, who accomplished, a very, very modest person. And I guess Ferdie Smith was similar. They should have a statue to Ferdie Smith in Jamaica, yes. But they should have a statue to Richard Hart.
And Richard Hart too, yep.
Yeah. And others, you know, yeah. So I doubt if many people knew about him. I was educated by those people I was privileged to meet. Cleston knew of him, Cleston, and Trevor Carter, of course, lived with Billy Strachan for his first couple of years in England, and Billy would have told him about Ferdinand Smith, and particularly that trip to Jamaica in '52. By the way, so if I can just...
Oh, no, do, please, yeah.
That trip to Jamaica, it was supposed to be a journey around the British Caribbean, but they were banned from entering every other country by the colonial authorities. They were stopped from getting into Trinidad, stopped from going to Guyana, what was then British Guiana, stopped from going to Grenada. But I guess because both of them were Jamaican, they were allowed to speak, and they attracted. There were photos of vast crowds of workers listening to them. And of course, that crucial year of 1952, the workers were extremely militant, and they did their best to create a socialist party. The closest they came was the People's Freedom Movement. But Jamaican, I mean, I've lived there a number of years. That was much later in the 80s. Jamaican politics can be quite brutal. And it was just as, well, it was even worse for them, because normally it's the two parties fighting each other. But this was the attempts to set up a new party.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting. Anybody else want to make any comments or ask questions? I see Dirk has said in the chat how she was interested in the kind of international relations that you had outside of America and the Caribbean as well.
Yes, indeed. Yes, absolutely. And I think him, particularly in the 20s and early 30s, sailing, because he would travel all over the world. And he mentions, I gave a quote somewhere of what he saw I think it could have been South Africa. Yeah. He certainly visited South Africa, where he witnessed the atrocious conditions of the workers. And of course, other seamen would have brought back messages and carried messages backwards and forwards. I would recommend Gerald Horne's book to anyone interested. I mean, I did the little thing on Billy Strachan because nobody else had. And somebody needs to do a proper book on Billy Strachan. It won't be me because of my eyesight. But Gerald Horne is he's an amazing African-American historian. He's written on a number of, he's not a communist, but he's written on a number of African-American communists. Ben Davis, William Patterson, and this obviously on Ferdinand Smith. Highly recommended.
Thanks, David. Paul, you got your hand up?
Yeah, thanks so much, David. I missed the last bit of what you said because my computer went off. I hope it sounded like you were reading something. Perhaps you could what you have written, you can somehow post it on the CLS website. Good to read.
Was it Richard Hart's speech at his funeral?
Sorry, was it?
What?
No, generally what you said. Sorry, I mean
I was just recommending Gerald Horne's book on Ferdinand Smith.
Sorry if I interrupted your line of
thought.
No,
not at all. No, I don't. This is where Steve will have to help me out. I'm ignorant. I don't know how to do it.
Not right now, but whenever you get a chance.
Steve.
Can I say anything that you want me to circulate?
Yeah.
I have a list of everyone who registered for this meeting, so that we could circulate anything you wanted to attendees.
So I can email you and you'll...
Anything you send to me, I can spread around.
Thank you. I'm computer illiterate. I don't know. I can do this, but...
Steve can sort you out, yes.
Thank you.
Anyway, David, thanks again. I learned a lot from what you said. As you lived in Jamaica too, you know how bad it is. And, you know, I mean, Norman Manley, I've often seen as a progressive figure. But from what you've said and what I knew about what he did and said to Marcus Garvey, far from progressive. So we certainly need somebody like that right now. That's for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, it was him who, it was Manley who expelled Richard Hart.
That's right. And his rehabilitation was only very partial back in the, whenever it was, not so long ago. It was only a partial rehabilitation.
Absolutely. That, yeah. I think that's maybe what you, that's right. Because somebody asked me if there's anything for Ferdie in Jamaica. And I said, I doubt it very much that he's recognised. And the same with Dick. You're quite right. It took until I think the 1990s for the PMP to recognise Richard Hart. Yeah.
No, we have a long way to go to reclaim what Lula's in Brazil. We need to take a leaf out of the book.
Absolutely. Well, the two prior speakers, very, very inspiring. So it's what can be done. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, indeed.
And looking at the lives of people like Ferdie Smith and Dick Hart and others, you know, Billy Strachan. Yeah.
Thanks again.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That was really interesting. And I can see in the chat that people really learned things they didn't know about before. That's great. Steve, do we need to? Is anybody else anything else we need to raise before the end of the meeting?
No, I think all that remains is to thank all of the speakers and to thank everyone for coming. And if anyone got in late or had to leave early or whatever, I'll once I've sorted out the video, I'll put it on the website. And a reminder that the previous talks that people have given, previous meetings are up there, so it pays a visit. Jean asked about the book by Gerald Horne. It's called Red Seas.
Let me give you the full title, Steve. Red Seas, Ferdinand Smith and Radical Black Sailors in the United States and Jamaica. Horne is spelt with an E. Horne. Did you get all of it? It's a long title, Steve. Do you want me to repeat it?
I will. I'll make sure that that's circulated as well.
Thank you. Oh, there's also Buzz, the booklet that Buzz Johnson republished. It's called This Man Smith. That's an easy one.
And there is the
that's the one. That's Charles White's mural.
And there's the mural.
Fabulous. I think you'll recognise some of them. Yeah, that Charles White is the most wonderful artist. Was the most wonderful artist. You can see Frederick Douglass almost in the middle, with the white hair and the beard. Oh, thank you, Francisco. You put it up there.
Yeah, it's great.
Many thanks.
Right.
So thanks very much. I think it's been a really good meeting. Thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, CLS.
Okay, and we'll see you in the new year.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much, David. That was good. Thank you.
No, thank you and the comrades. Thanks a lot.
Good. Right. Well, keep in touch.
Yeah,
Bye-bye, everybody.
all the best.
Close the
Bye.
meeting now.
I shall leave.
Bye-bye.